Folks, welcome back to another episode of the IMGPH podcast. We're very excited to have DeRonn Kidd. A quick intro on DeRonn. DeRonn has received his Master's of Public Health with a concentration in Community and International Health in 2014. He's currently serving as a manager on Health Services, Strategy and Innovation team at CVS Health, the nation's largest healthcare company. In this role, DeRonn works with retail pharmacy strategy and focuses on new projects related to growth opportunities in pharmacy. His work entails responding to high level business questions from senior executives, working on special projects, and ideating net new ideas. But rather than me introducing DeRonn, we have DeRonn right here. DeRonn, welcome to the IMGPH podcast.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Glad
Excited
to
to
have
be
you
here.
here. We're so happy to have you here. Why don't you start us off by introducing yourself? Walk us through the journey from undergrad to where you are right now. I'd love to hear it all.
Yeah, definitely. And so let me go ahead and just jump off with saying thank you for having me here. Really appreciate it. Excited to be here. Excited to share more about my journey, and also have updates for you too as well. So actually, I'm in a new role currently right now. So
Wow.
and
Congratulations.
I'll get to that when I get to that part of my journey. Again, DeRonn Kidd, nice to meet you. Nice to meet everyone. And yes, currently working at CVS Health in a new role. But I'll start from the beginning of my journey. So completed my undergrad at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and then completed my Master of Public Health at NYU. And also I have an MBA from the University of Rochester, Simon Business School with a focus on strategy. And so that's a little bit of, like, I guess you can say, my introduction. And in terms of like my career trajectory and what brings me here and how I arrived at CVS, I'm happy to kind of like walk you through that, if that works.
Absolutely. Tell us more about, I mean, there's so many, what you have described as the dream of some students, right? Multiple degrees, diversity in multiple areas. How did that journey start off for you? What made you move to different spaces, get an MBA?
Yeah.
There's a lot out there.
Yeah. There's it's that's such a great question. I think it's a layered question too, because it touches on so many points, right? I'll say that, like, when my career first began, that was not the plan per se, right? Something that became clear over time as I kind of moved through both my career and, I guess, my interests developed and my goals developed. But yeah, it started out with, again, I mentioned I was at Michigan for undergrad, and from Michigan, I went to complete a fellowship at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and this was a fellowship that was coordinated by the Gillings School of Public Health and the Keenan Flagler Business School. And basically, the project work there entailed a number of things, from financial assessments, public health, prevention practice, health education, and health policy. And it gave me a really great introduction to not only what work looks like in public health on a grander scale in the social sector, because now I'm working within this university, but also as a fellow, I was working among other great leaders, within the field. And it really opened my eyes up to, like, wow, this is what public health work looks like. Yes, we know it as like your traditional roles, but I didn't realize that there were non-traditional roles, that existed. And I think that is what ultimately opened the door to the next role as well. And I can tell you more about that, but I think, to your question, like, it's just been an interesting journey, like, going through all of this now.
There's this key word, non-traditional roles.
Yeah.
3 words actually. So what stands out to me about that is that I have a strong feeling that this comes in front of many students that
Yeah.
are thinking right now that I must follow this design path. And that works for a lot of people. They have
Yeah.
that design path. But for those people that have that thing inside them where there's something different, I want to be synergistic, I want to have collaborated with this environment and that environment, and you were exposed to different mindsets and industries that helped you expand that. But what would you tell a student right now that is looking for that non-traditional role, is looking for something that's designed for them, or how can
Mhm.
they design what they're looking for themselves?
Yeah. I think, two things. One, be very intentional about what it is that you want to pursue or what it is that you're interested in learning more about. And then two, be open to opportunities that might look a little different than what you expected. So kind of just continuing on with that part of the story. where I completed that fellowship, one of the things that I got introduced to there was, the world of global pharmaceuticals. And I remember this distinctly. Like, I was like, oh, I was like, pharma, public health? I never made the connection at that particular point. I didn't have someone to necessarily tell me that. But then I had a chance to be around leaders that worked in the space, and they were like, oh, no, this is public health. Let me show you how. And then I had a lot of prior experience in clinical research already. And so you could just say it presented an opportunity for me to take that next step. But in order for that to work, like, I had to be receptive, right? I had to go beyond just like, oh, well, this is what traditional roles typically look like, right? And I had to also be really clear and intentional about what it was that I was looking for, right? And this lined up, for that perfectly.
I have so many questions that are coming up. Let's take a step back. Can you've spoken about doing roles that gave you a skill set and then going into roles that were unexpected. Can you walk us through that journey of you walked us through your journey of the academic journey essentially. Can you
Mhm.
talk more about your career trajectory and how that evolved over time?
Yeah. I think, what began as work in a fellowship, in public health, transitioned into work in global pharma, doing clinical research, developing a vaccine tied to multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, right? But I knew, after that I had more of an interest in more goals that were tied to healthcare management and policy. That brought me back to school, got the MPH, but I also knew that I had an interest in consulting, right? And so I was like, whoa, consulting is typically something you need an MBA for. Like, how can I use the experience I have in healthcare with my MPH to make that pivot? And I was able to successfully make that pivot, and stepped into consulting, doing work around healthcare management and policy. And then, after success within that field, like, I took a leap of faith, worked as an entrepreneur full time, right? Left healthcare for a moment there, and achieved success as an entrepreneur, but realized that my I guess you can say my passion, my heart was truly in, healthcare and within public health. Pivoted back and continued to do many of the same work that I was doing prior to that pivot, but wanted to do more work that had a strategy focus, and had been knocking on the door of strategy for some time, and realized that, that MBA with that focus on strategy would help open that door and, move me, I guess, to the next level. That's exactly what it did. And then that brought me to CVS. So that kind of goes back to what I said before about being really intentional, but also being kind of open to, like, these opportunities, sometimes looking a little different than what you expected. Like, that healthcare consulting role that I had post, MPH looked a little different than what I expected, but it gave me a wealth of experience, right? Coming out of that public health fellowship, going into pharma looked different than what I expected, but it gave me a wealth of experience, right? So it was always just kind of being open to the opportunity and saying, okay, I'm ready, let's go.
Wow. Okay. There's this area of the wealth of information that you're receiving and the knowledge that you have. And what stands out to me is how does one find the balance between taking a leap of faith into right place, right
Yeah,
time
yeah,
and versus defining.
yeah,
There's this constant defining, who am I? Who am I? That's a question a
yeah,
lot of students have.
yeah,
And then this other side is that, okay, should I accept this? I don't know if it's the right thing for me.
yeah,
There is kind of like a tug of war.
yeah.
And what was it for you? How much definition or
Mhm.
identifying my path happened, and how much not defining that and surrendering essentially happened for you?
Yeah, I think, there's the idea that if you so it's I mean, to use your word, surrender, right? If you surrender, or if you trust the process, that means that that your path is not defined. And I couldn't disagree with that more. Like, I think what it actually is that, like, you're clear on your path, but you're also trusting that, like, your path may unfold in a way that looks a little different than what you thought it was going to look like, right? So you
Mhm.
can be very clear on your path. You can be very clear on, like, this is what I want to do, right? But if someone comes to you and says, hey, here's an opportunity for you to do these X, Y, and Z, and whatever it is that they're describing lines up with exactly what some of the things that you said you wanted to do on your path. Oh, well, wait a minute, that sounds exactly like what you said you wanted, right? So sometimes it's hard to, or one of the challenges though is that we can be so focused on things looking the way that we want them to look, that if it doesn't show up exactly how we want it to look, then we figure, oh, well, I didn't get it. like I failed, or my path is not clear. No, that's not the case. That's not the case at all. So it really, I think, is more about a balance between, being very clear and intentional about what your path is, but also not being too rigid, about how you expect it to show itself.
Wow. Amazing. Don't control the uncontrollables.
Exactly. Control the controllables, but don't control the uncontrollables. Exactly.
I love that. And I'm sure a lot of listeners are writing the little words of wisdom down right there.
Yeah.
Walk us through that entrepreneurial journey that you went through, because
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
one of these defining paths for you, including
Yeah.
surrender, right? To some degree. What was that
Yeah.
like, that journey?
Yeah. So, and I think entrepreneurship really gets at the point of like both surrendering, but also gets at the point of like, you realizing that you have to really give your all, but at the same time trust. Like, and so entrepreneurship was, I mean, I'll be honest with you, it was not something that I was like, I had mapped out. Like, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna be this entrepreneur. It was more or less like, you know what, if there's an opportunity, I saw an opportunity, it was presenting itself. It had been presenting itself for some time. And, I felt like I was being pushed in that direction. And, as an entrepreneur, I work specifically as, an internationally acclaimed and award-winning photographer and marketing strategist, which is distinctly different from anything related to healthcare or public health, right? But this was something that I had been, I guess you more or less been pushed towards, for years actually, in various capacities, but achieved a level of success that I never expected, right? I covered projects across 4 of the 7 continents. I worked with a number of high level, both high level and high profile individuals. Worked with a number of Fortune 500 companies. Worked with a number of major both companies within the advertising space, as well as major schools within academia, to push forward projects. Had the opportunity to be put in front of top level execs to help lead projects. There were things that I never even dreamed of happening that were happening as a result of me just following exactly what I just described a moment ago. And so again, that clarity has served me in terms of providing that diversity of experience, but at the same time, the trusting, and being okay, all right, let's see where this goes, has also allowed me to do things and achieve things I never even imagined.
Wow. There's this photography aspect that you brought up,
Mhm.
and there's something about, and the theme to me is around, apart from the path that you have formed, the non-traditional element that's
Yeah,
coming into this. And I remember when reading about you, there was a lot to do with music, there was a lot to do with food and the outdoors and your relationship with that, and photography. So how
yeah.
have all these not, do you think that there's a synergy or a correlation with the non-traditional paths and the public health world in your world?
It's possible. I think you can possibly make that correlation. I think that those things that you just touched on are part of what make me who I am, right? So we can have this path and we can talk about what we want to achieve in our careers, but at the end of the day, you are who you are, right? You have your individual interests, you have your individual areas that like you love or that you're passionate about, right? And I'm a firm believer, do the things that you're most passionate about, right? And success will come, right? It is true. Success will come, as long as you are very clear on that. So I do think that there is some connection on some level. I don't know if I would say that like, you know, uh, that there is the non-traditional path and then, what I have my interests are and that there might be correlation there. I don't know if I would say that as much as I would say that like, I've always had these interests. I've always had these passions, right? I just never dreamed that those interests and passions would open these doors, some of these doors, right? Like, and when those doors presented themselves, like I was blown away. I'll give you an example. Like when I first had my first like international, project, like I remember being there and doing it and being like, this is really real. This is surreal. This is actually happening. Oh my gosh. Like, I was in, so my first project abroad was in Morocco. So I'm in Africa in Morocco and I'm doing this and I'm like, this is really happening. Like, yeah, right. Like, but at the same time, I think I had to be also really comfortable. Oh, and I just realized I didn't say this, but this is really a key part of this process. I had to be really comfortable with stepping out of my comfort zone.
Mm.
And I think that's an important piece of this discussion that I think is really key, is that you have, if you want certain it can be public health, it can be healthcare, it could be your entrepreneurial pursuits, or it can be whatever your particular interests are. if you want certain levels of success to find you, you have to be willing to, step out of that comfort zone to a degree, right? As they say, the greater the risk, the greater the reward, right? And so, that was something that I think I found myself following, and it has brought me, to where I am now.
Speaking of where you are now, tell us more about your journey at CVS, this evolution that's taken place, and we're excited to hear the newest details of
Yeah.
your current role as well. So, can you walk us through that journey?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, I my journey began with CVS actually as an MBA intern, in 2020, and I worked on I was working on the retail pharmacy strategy team, and specifically working on a project that dealt with developing a commercialization strategy around how. And I can't be too specific about it because some of this is proprietary information, but I had to develop a commercialization strategy around how to market basically a new product within the retail pharmacies. Now, here I am at this point in my life, in my career, with a lot of experience in healthcare, but this particular product that I had to, or I had to think about, the strategy I had to develop around this was something that was uniquely challenging, but also like eye-opening as well. And loved it, great strategy experience. And then I was presented with a full-time opportunity to join the company, and specifically with the health services strategy and innovation team, with the retail pharmacy strategy team. And for those that don't know much about CVS, again, it is not just simply a pharmacy chain. It is the largest healthcare company in the country, right? So this, as part of a Fortune 4 and the nation's largest healthcare company, my team was responsible for driving forward new ideas and placing strategic bets, shaping the future of one of the core businesses within the company. And in this role, we, as you've touched on already, we worked on new projects related to growth opportunities in pharmacy. So, that was something that gave me, I mean, just a wealth of experience and exposure, to, everything from retail to digital pharmacy to omni-channel to primary care to, doing work around mergers and acquisitions, due diligence, you name it. It was really high level strategy work. And then now my most recent role. So now I work as a senior manager, and on the Aetna side of the business. So Aetna is part of CVS. Like, it's not a different company. It's still part of the same company. It's just on a different side of the business. And in this role, as a senior manager, I am responsible for basically helping developing and implementing, I guess a program and strategy that meets expectations around, I guess, standing up, I guess you can say, programs that are tied to both health education services, driving improved health equity, and population health management within the Medicaid markets in California, specifically within San Diego and Sacramento. And so when I tell you that I didn't even know that an opportunity like this existed prior, and now here I am doing this, right? But does it continue to build on my prior experiences? It does. And so, yeah, here we are.
Love to hear that. And very happy for you. Congratulations on the new role. Perhaps when you listen to this podcast a few years later, it will be something completely beyond what was imaginable based on
Yeah,
how you speak about it as well.
I hope so. Yeah.
I trust that that's going to happen. Replay that. So one question that came up is that there's a lot of preconceived notions about this whole pharma world, right? And even you brought it up when, oh, pharma and public.
Mm,
What is the connection? What were some myths that were busted when you hopped into the world of pharma?
yeah, I think that's a really that's a really great question. So okay, so I mentioned before I worked in pharma, specifically with Otsuka Pharmaceuticals. Otsuka is a company based out of Japan. The office that I worked out of was here in the States. And Otsuka Pharmaceutical, they have a number of, I guess you can say, products within the pharma space. But the team that I worked on was specifically designed and focused on work related to tuberculosis. So Otsuka is the top private funder of tuberculosis research and drug development in the world, and also responsible for leading the largest prospective drug trial on multi-drug resistant tuberculosis to ever be conducted. And it spanned across the entire world, like across 5 continents. And I think what we saw here with this role and with this team was that the company was really trying to say, hey, we really want to do something that's meaningful and impactful, right? We really want to be able to work with, be it countries or be it with populations, that have historically struggled, with managing or have had a high burden of TB and managing, the global TB epidemic, specifically within a lot of developing countries, right? And so I think this, again, we don't typically think of pharma in this light, this more positive light. But what we saw here was that, like, it is possible for a company in the space to do meaningful and impactful work that, you would maybe even call equitable, right, in a lot of ways. And another part of this too is that, like, it actually helped me to see, okay, this is the role of pharma in healthcare. This is the role of pharma in driving forward innovation, right? People sometimes forget that part, like that, pharmaceutical companies, for all of the hoorah and the bad news we hear about them, right? They are actually really responsible for driving a significant amount of innovation within the space, right? And so, and then, I mean, we've also heard, interesting things about like health insurance companies too, right? And don't get me started. We've also heard things about like pharmacy benefit management companies, right? So there's always some kind of, how do I say this? Be it stereotype or connotation associated with each of these, but if you look deeply enough, you can find opportunities that align with your values.
I'm sure a lot of students are motivated, encouraged, and are going to replay this portion of the interview. But let's make the last part for them.
Okay.
As a prior GPH student and a grad from NYU, what would you say? Can you talk about some of your experiences? How do students best position themselves when they come to school as they're graduating? Something about your experiences. What would you share with students about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, let's start with like those helpful classes that you can take within GPH, to help really prepare you for like your career, your future career, and like some of those goals and interests that you may have. And one thing I've always stressed the importance of is, one, data. Like, I think we live in a time right now where everything is based in data. We're all on social media, right? Right. And so how does social media work? Social media is only even possible largely because of data and technology. And so it's the same thing here. And if you have an understanding of, or even a comfort level with data, and I'm not saying you got to be an expert, I'm not saying you got to know it thoroughly, but if you can say, hey, I've taken a biostats class and it's given me some introduction to how to use data, or I'm even, comfortable in EPI when we touch on the data aspects of that. Same thing, like lean into that. It's going to be uncomfortable. It wasn't fun for me. I'll just tell you now, but it does benefit you. It pays dividends, going forward. Another thing is think about what you want to accomplish in your career. For me, I mentioned earlier, healthcare management and policy was a big, driver for me. And that actually ended up being one of my favorite courses that I took, during my time in GPH. And so that would be something else I would, suggest as well. And then the next component beyond like your classes that you're taking are, all right, what are the industries that, public health professionals are entering? We touched on this already. We touched on like traditional versus non-traditional. I don't necessarily need to name the traditional. I think we are all really familiar with what those look like, but the non-traditional are often the ones that most people don't know as much about, right? So we're very familiar with public sector, government, nonprofit work, traditional. But when we think of, the non-traditional, especially when we start talking about corporate, consulting, pharma, or even companies like CVS, there's a lot of great work that's being done there. So really take the time to explore and learn what those opportunities can look like. If you're based in New York City, I cannot tell you, there are such a wealth and diverse array of opportunities in New York. Like, explore them, and that brings me to my next point, is leveraging that GPH network, connect with alum, connect with your fellow students, pick their brains. Of course, know of some things, but they know of some things as well too. But leverage that network and find people that are working within some of those spaces or within those companies, or that have that experience that, that is of interest to you, and leverage it, and they can, if you can't open the doors, they can either open the doors for you, or they can point you to the individuals that can open those doors for you. And then the last point, is kind of building on what I just said. I just touched on the power of networking within GPH, but also go beyond GPH. Like, network with thought leaders, network with people who are doing the work that is of interest or that have alignment with your career goals. that have alignment with your values. And again, doors will open. And when you're doing that, identify mentors. Identify individuals who can say, hey, you know what? I want to teach you, or I want to instruct you, or I want to help guide you, and help you develop further as a leader. It goes a long way in terms of, really, really helping you grow as a future leader within public health.
That's a masterclass in a few minutes for you folks. DeRonn, we leave our guests with this final question every time we end the podcast. It's called a magic wand question.
Oh,
If I give you a magic wand to solve one public health issue in the world, what would it be for you at this time?
hmm. I think, as passionate as I am about health equity, I think that would be my magic wand. When I think about, anything from health disparities to social determinants of health, when I think about, the areas in which we see a lack of equity, I immediately think, that is where I would wave my magic wand, and I would address, all of those inequities and all of those problems, so that we could, be not only in a more equitable world, but more importantly, so that we could all have proper access to, be it proper care, or be it just, the best lives that we all deserve to have. So yeah.
And you all deserve the best, every viewer of this podcast and anyone even not listening. DeRonn Kidd, thank you so much for your time, all your wisdom, and I'm sure students are going to get, and listeners are going to get a lot out of this one.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here. Really great to be here, and so happy that I could share more about my journey.